Hello, and welcome to the Daily Rings of Power podcast, your daily dose of the latest news, rumours, and speculation about the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power. The day is Wednesday, August 24th, and I'm your host, Harry. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. This is going to be another special episode, as we received our final trailer for the show yesterday. There was an abundance of new footage and dialogue here, and I have so much I want to talk about. We're going to go through this trailer scene by scene, so feel free to follow along at home with the trailer in the background. However, I will say right at the top of the show that I think this trailer did offer some very spoilery details. If you do want to go into this series unspoiled, I would suggest leaving this episode now, as while I'll mainly be speculating, I do think our speculation is now approaching spoiler territory with terrifying accuracy. But first, we must start, as always, with a reading from the Professor's work. Today, our reading comes from The Lord of the Rings, Book 1, The Shadow of the Past. "It is no laughing matter," said Gandalf. "Not for you. It was the strangest event in the whole history of the ring so far. Bilbo's arrival just at that time, and putting his hand on it blindly in the dark. There was more than one power at work, Frodo. The ring was trying to get back to its master. It had slipped from Isildur's hand and betrayed him. Then, when a chance came, it caught poor Degol, and he was murdered. And after that Gollum, and it had devoured him. It could make no further use of him. He was too small and mean, and as long as it stayed with him, he would never leave his deep pool again. So now, when its master was awake once more, and sending out his dark thought from Mirkwood, it abandoned Gollum, only to be picked up by the most unlikely person imaginable, Bilbo from the Shire. Behind that, there was something else at work, beyond any design of the Ringmaker. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker, in which case you also were meant to have it, and that may be an encouraging thought." Now, without further ado, we're going to get into our scene-by-scene breakdown of the final trailer for the Rings of Power. Once again, a final reminder to turn away now if you don't want speculation and any potential spoilers. The trailer opens with familiar scenes of Finrod in battle, Galadriel taking the dagger from his lifeless hands. In a visual sense, it's a literal picking up of the sword to carry on the fight that her brother was leading. She says, "My brother gave his life hunting the enemy. His task is now mine." At 18 seconds as she withdraws the dagger, you can see the mark of Sauron emblazoned or branded on his chest. Once again, while the show won't be able to depict the story of Beren and Luthien, it's clear they will be alluding to Finrod's capture, imprisonment, and death at the hands of Sauron, all of which are going to be motivating forces for Galadriel at the start of this series. Moving on, we get some beautiful shots of Númenórean ships sailing, leaving the kingdom to head to Middle-earth, the sun emblem emblazoned on their sails. Galadriel, we see, joins the ship and repeats the line we've heard before, "Stand with me." As we've already discussed on previous episodes, it's clear that Galadriel's presence on Númenor is going to be part of the main reason why we see these ships departing to join the fight in Middle-earth. But after that, we get what may be some of the most important lines in all of the trailers from Galadriel. She says, "Ours was no chance meeting, not fate nor destiny. Ours was the work of something greater." Galadriel's lines here echo one of the greater themes of Tolkien's work, that luck or chance is not really that at all. Within Tolkien's world, there is no question that there is a divine force, an omniscient and omnipotent god, Eru Ilúvatar, We see this many times throughout the stories of the Legendarium, that where these events happen by chance or through luck, what we're actually seeing is divine providence, the invisible hand of Iluvatar at work. I talked about this on Twitter, but it's one of the central themes of the story that there is a greater force at work shaping these events. In fact, in one of Tolkien's letters, letter 192 to be precise, he refers to the fact that Gollum falling into Mount Doom after taking the ring from Frodo is precisely the work of such a greater power. The other power then took over. The writer of the story, by which I do not mean myself, that one ever-present person who is never absent and never named. As I said on Twitter, this is what matters to me in an adaptation. Do the writers and creators of the show understand the larger philosophical and even metaphysical themes at play? While I can't say for sure that the Rings of Power will always stick the landing here, I'm very impressed by what we've seen so far, and no doubt you can now see why I chose the reading I did to start today's episode. Returning to the scenes in the trailer, we get single shots of Elendil, Durin, and Halbrand all melded together. Then we see a beautiful shot of elvish children playing in an idyllic natural setting, which I think we can safely assume is Valinor, as we've had confirmation for a child actor playing young Galadriel. It would make sense if this is who we're seeing, and I suspect this is all part of the prologue we'll get recounting the history of the First Age. Next, we get a familiar shot of those white-robed cultists before what I can only describe as an almost jump scare moment as the lead cultist appears close up to the camera. We do get a better shot of their decorative metal harness, but it's still hard to decipher much from these symbols. I can see some pretty creepy faces in these symbols as well as a sun emblem, but none of it's really ringing any specific lore bells for me. It's worth saying in a recent Time magazine article, it was confirmed that these cultists are travelling west from the land of Rhûn. We know little of Rhûn from the texts, except that it lies to the east of Mordor and the rest of Middle-earth, and that many of the men who stayed there came under the dominion of Morgoth and later Sauron. It'll be interesting to see what role these cultists play, but I have a theory on that we're going to explore later in the trailer. Next, we get a scene of the Stranger and the Harfoots being stalked and cornered by some rather terrifying-looking wolf creatures. I've heard some people say that this is making them think that there's still a chance the Stranger is Sauron, given the latter's association with werewolves in the First Age. But I don't think this is a scene of the Stranger somehow charming or communicating with the wolves. Instead, if we look back at the brief scene we saw in the Comic-Con trailer, where the Stranger seems to put forth some great shockwave or force of energy, I think instead this is a scene where the Stranger is going to be defending the Harfoots, using this innate power that he's learning to control. For me, it just reinforces the idea that he is most likely some kind of benevolent Maiar, and most likely one of the wizards, although as we'll see later in the trailer, which wizard he could be is still very much up for debate. And I also think that displays of his power like this may be well-intentioned, but may lead to harmful and dangerous consequences for the Harfoots around him. Next up, we get some extended dialogue from Miriel, as she says, "Each of us, every one, must decide who we shall be." Once again, we're getting dialogue that refers to the greater themes of the Second Age story. The tale of Númenor and its fall is really about the people of Númenor as a whole turning away from the Eldar and the Valar, and turning inwards to their own pride and ambition. But at the end of the day, all of them are individuals who make this choice. Therefore, when we think about the divide in Númenor between the King's men and the faithful, it's really about the choice of a society, but each person who is part of that society is almost like a grain of sand that could tip the balance of Númenor's future one way or the other. I assume this scene does match the shots we get of Miriel addressing the Númenorian royal court, and I love the visual language of Pharazôn standing directly opposite to her on his own raised plinth. It immediately clues in the viewers that while Pharazôn may start the series as a counsellor to the Queen Regent, they are both heading in opposite and conflicting directions. Only one of these is going to win out. Alongside this, we get shots of Gil-galad, Isildur, and Arondir. I think Miriel's lines particularly apply to Isildur, given that we know his future is really about a series of key choices he's going to make about who and what he will be. Gil-galad's shot, on the other hand, looks like it may match one of two scenes. It could be that he's looking at Elrond and Durin, which would make sense given we've now seen two teasers where Gil-galad is trying to convince Elrond that his loyalty must be to his own people, before that of his friendship and alliance with the dwarves. Or, given that he's on a hillside looking down, this could be him watching Galadriel and company depart on their ship heading west. I think Gil-galad himself is going to be wrestling with some tough decisions this season, about how to keep his kingdom and his people safe. Therefore, it would also make sense if he's looking at Galadriel departing and wondering whether he's made the right decision. Following this, we get what sounds like an exchange between Halbrand and Galadriel. I do think that this is actually two separate scenes of them. However, what's clear is that we're getting a peek into Halbrand's backstory in terms of his motivations and the emotional baggage he seems to be carrying. He says, "I am not the hero you seek," to which Galadriel later seems to respond, "Whatever it is you did, be free of it." I think it's very interesting that Halbrand is clearly a very morally grey character with a troubled past, but also that Galadriel's own advice to him may at some point be relevant to her. As we've seen throughout this trailer and others, Galadriel herself is carrying the almost crushing weight of her past, and she's trying to fight her way out of it through a sheer white-knuckle force of will. But as we'll come back to at the end of this trailer, I think the idea of having to leave your past behind is going to be something key to Galadriel's arc across Season 1. We then have a brief exchange from our lead dwarves, with Disa saying to Durin, "One day this will be your kingdom." It's a good reminder that, as I discussed in part 1 of my soundtrack analysis, where I examined Durin's theme, we're likely going to see an evolution in his character across the seasons. I think we're being led to believe that we will see a very literal representation of the common phrase, "heavy is the head that wears the crown," and I can't wait to see how this is going to affect Durin. Following that, we get a new piece of dialogue. "Choose not the path of fear, but that of faith." I think this is Galadriel speaking once again, and I can't tell you how much this really does reinforce my earlier point about the show embracing Tolkien's themes. Especially in his First Age and Second Age stories, the thing that leads to the downfall of many characters, and even whole cultures, is that they abandon their faith in higher powers. Whether we're talking about Fëanor and the exile of the Noldor resulting from his abandonment of his faith in the ability of the Valar to bring justice, or, later, the Númenóreans' loss of faith in the gift of Ilúvatar regarding their own mortality. It's very important to me that the show doesn't treat faith or belief in higher powers trivially or cynically, and I'm really glad to see that the show is embracing these spiritual themes with both hands. After some brief shots that we've already seen before, we get some great shots of Theo and Arondir being pursued through the woods at night by a pack of orcs, followed by an overhead shot of torch-carrying figures heading towards what I can only assume is a human settlement. I have to say the thing that struck out to me here was the scale of this scene. I think we've been led to believe that we're only going to see very small battles and fights in the first season, but it looks to me like while we won't see thousands of orcs, we're definitely going to be getting some reasonably large-scale conflicts. Most interestingly, we get our clearest shot of Adar yet, standing above his band of torch-carrying orcs. While it's only a side profile and dimly lit, there are a few details we can discern from this shot of our Season 1 villain. This shot to me once again confirms that Adar is some kind of corrupted and maybe even mutilated elf. We see what look like scars and maybe even brand marks on his face, but also we see a piece of golden armour on his chest that carries a similar wave pattern that we've seen on both the armour of Gil-galad as well as less prominently on the clothes of other elves like Elrond. I covered the theories as to who Adar might be on the second ever episode of our podcast, and so I won't go over them again here. But the evidence is certainly building that Adar is a corrupted elf from the First Age, and most likely one of the Noldor with some form of connection to Galadriel and Gil-galad. Next up, we finally get some Harfoot content, and just a really heartwarming piece of dialogue, as we hear Largo saying, "One thing we can do, better than any creature in all of Middle-earth, we stay true to each other, with our hearts even bigger than our feet." I just love how heartfelt and hopeful this dialogue is. I know some people might see it as cheesy or trite, but for me it harkens back to Tolkien's core themes of the bonds of family and fellowship, of the importance of courage in the face of evil, and how that particularly resonates to the stories of the hobbits. However, one of the most interesting parts of this exchange is a scene that sits behind it, of the Harfoot Nori handing an apple to the stranger. In the wide shot, we can see that the apple tree above Nori's head actually seems to be dying or is being corrupted as the fruit and branches have turned black. I suspect this is all going to be part of the underlying story of the spread of evil, and that it can be physically felt in the corruption of the land and of nature. It's also significant, as we've heard from the Harfoot characters in interviews, that there is actually an apple orchard with great meaning to their culture, as it's where they bury their dead, and they all carry apple seeds in memory of their lost loved ones. I wonder if this destruction of such a sacred space is one of the reasons that the Harfoots will move further west. For those of you that want to hear more about Harfoots, tune in to our next episode where I'm going to be discussing the whole of the Harfoot storyline with my good friend Kylie. After some very intense shots of Galadriel and Halbrand seemingly doing their best to survive their struggles at sea after being shipwrecked and, well, whatever is happening with that sea monster, we have a brief shot of Arondir talking to Bronwyn, where he says, "We can survive this, you and I." As we saw in a short teaser released on Monday, it seems the core of the story for these two is whether they're going to be able to survive the coming strife. Their love story reflects many that Tolkien has told before, and it certainly reflects the story of Aignor and Andreth, the elf and the mortal woman whose doomed romance was not to be. I have to say, I'm left with a great feeling of dread, and if both these characters make it out the season alive, I'm going to be feeling incredibly relieved. After some more intense shots of Galadriel's company struggling in the frozen north, where she is clearly determined to forge on at all costs, we get some of my favourite exchanges in the whole trailer. In one scene, Halbrand, who is clearly very frustrated with Galadriel, asks her, "Why do you keep fighting?" Which is then followed by a separate scene of Galadriel standing inside what I assume is the Númenórean throne room and speaking to presumably Miriel, where she utters my favourite line from the trailer, "There is a tempest in me." I pointed out on Twitter how much this reminded me of Cate Blanchett's line delivery, not just as her portrayal of Galadriel in the Lord of the Rings films, but also when she portrayed another powerful leader in the film Elizabeth the Golden Age. In that film, Blanchett delivers a very similar line, and one that always sends chills up my spine, as she says, "I too can command the wind, sir. I have a hurricane in me that will strip Spain bare if you dare to try me." Both of these performances just exude sheer power, in a way that is both commanding and regal, but with an inner fury that works perfectly when considering Galadriel's character. Not only that, but you can see echoes of this character's later lines from the Fellowship of the Ring, where Galadriel declares that if she took the ring from Frodo, she would be a Dark Queen. And when you look at the original lines from Tolkien's speech, she says the line, "Dreadful as the storm and the lightning." Clearly, a great parallel here to the idea of a tempest raging inside Galadriel. For people who think the show is abandoning Galadriel's characterization from Tolkien's writings, I think there are more than enough clues here to suggest otherwise. I'm going to save the last exchange between Elrond and Galadriel for the end of my analysis, but it will tie back to this point and our earlier discussion of Galadriel's character arc. We do get some incredible shots of the Númenóreans, orcs, and Halbrand fighting, and while I assume this is already from the latter episodes of the season, I can't wait to see it. Practical, set-piece fight choreography is always something I'm looking for from TV series and shows. We also get some very telling individual shots of characters in the lead up to the end of the trailer, and I'm going to take them one by one. We see a tearful Eärien, Isildur's sister, standing in front of a crowd of Númenóreans. Based on rumours from Fellowship of fans, I think this may be a scene where Isildur is leaving with the Númenórean army, and she is sadly watching him leave. I'm really intrigued by this character, and I think her concern for losing more of her family, given that we know her mother has already died, is going to be a key driving force in her story arc. Will this fear of the loss of family and a fear of death be what drives her down a dark path? Or will she manage to maintain her hope in spite of it? We also get a shot of the stranger looking like he's screaming while all the trees around him bend and shake as if they're being drawn in by his power. Again, I think this reinforces the idea that the stranger has some kind of innate power he's learning to harness. I do wonder if this attunement to nature is perhaps a suggestion that he could be the least likely of all the wizards, Radagast the Brown. As someone who personally thought Radagast got treated quite poorly by Peter Jackson's adaptation of The Hobbit, I'd love to see a more powerful, earnest and sincere portrayal of him. But as always, I'm still very much on Team Blue Wizard, and I'm hoping this is who the character is going to be. Before we reach the end of our dialogue, we get what I think is our most spoilery shot of the whole trailer. If you don't want to know what is going to be one of the major final events of the season, I'd skip ahead a minute or two in this episode, because I really do think this is a spoiler. At 2 minutes and 25 seconds, we see a shot of Isildur looking either shocked or frightened, while in the background we see fire and smoke raining from the sky. And I think this finally answers the mystery of what causes the conflagration and explosion in the village that we see Galadriel and the Númenóreans saving. This is your last chance to turn away now if you don't want spoilers. For me, this almost definitely tells us that we are definitely going to see Mount Doom erupting for the first time. As we know that the Southlands is located in the area of the map that will one day become Mordor, it makes complete sense that this will be what drives them out, the eruption of a volcanic mountain. Not only that, but it's the best explanation yet as to why there would be some kind of fiery explosion that destroys the village. We've seen the shots in previous trailers of Galadriel covered in ash, waking up surrounded by fire and smoke, and we discussed in our soundtrack analysis that there's a track called The Veil of Smoke. This all makes sense if it's actually the result of fiery debris and ash from Orodruin finally exploding. As to how this matches up with the lore, we know that Sauron builds his fortress of Barad-dûr between 1000 and 1600 of the Second Age, the tail end of which is when he forged the One Ring. Therefore we can surmise that Mount Doom is already active by this time. Obviously it'll be interesting to see how this plays out with the show's time compression, but it certainly all adds up in terms of the order of events. I'll personally be interested to see if Mount Doom erupting is seen to be a natural event, because, referring back to our earlier conversation, I think it's much more likely that this has something to do with the work of those cultists, who may in fact be working directly for Sauron to bring destruction and death to the land. Who knows, maybe it'll be the work of Sauron himself, given he has the power of a Maiar and may be able to directly influence the natural world. To finish, I'm going to end the trailer discussion with Elrond and Galadriel's final lines. We hear Elrond's familiar line from the earlier teaser trailers where he says, "You have fought long enough, Galadriel. Put up your sword." However, in this trailer, we hear her respond with a real weight of emotion in her voice. She says, "Without it, what am I to be?" I think this is fundamentally Galadriel's arc in this show, drawn all together in one line. As we said earlier, she is clearly carrying all that weight of her family's death in the First Age with her, and she's decided that the way to overcome these traumatic events is to fight her way to peace and a resolution for her inner struggles. But as I suspect we'll see, Galadriel's arc is going to be about realizing she cannot fight her way out of the pain and the loss she's suffered. Much as Éowyn's arc in Lord of the Rings is about finding that a nihilistic pursuit of death and glory is not the way to live, Galadriel will also go on a journey to finding peace and purpose through focusing on her people, her family, and her love for Middle-earth. For me, this is a beautiful story to tell, and it goes back to the key themes that both the showrunners and the cast have told us what they want to explore. How do these characters, who've seen so much loss and pain, and experienced so much trauma, find the will to keep on going, and find the hope to move forward and to love again? In terms of a closing argument for the marketing campaign for this show, I don't think they could have chosen anything better in my opinion. It's the idea of hope in the face of despair that is the one thing that always draws me back to Tolkien, and in today's world, it's something I feel we desperately need. That's where I'm going to end for my breakdown of the trailer for The Rings of Power. With 1 week to go, I've never been more excited. I should also say, I'll be attending the world premiere in London next Tuesday, and while I won't be able to give a spoiler review until the show airs, I'll definitely be bringing you an episode, talking to you about the experience of attending the premiere and sharing what limited spoiler-free thoughts I can. I'd love to continue the conversation about this trailer on Twitter, so let me know what your favourite moments were. What are you most excited to see now, and what are your theories for the storylines we've been teased throughout these trailers? As always, I'd greatly appreciate if you could leave a rating or review on whichever podcast platform you use, and if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. I also want to say, if you enjoy the show, please do share it, whether it's on your social media or with your family and friends. I really want to keep building this community of smart and interesting listeners who I take so much pleasure in discussing this show with every day on Twitter. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back soon with more discussion of the latest news on the Daily Rings of Power podcast. Namarie.